Hey everyone, this is Keith Baker. I am the host of the Dancing with Cancer podcast, where we talk about how to live an upbeat, joyful life in the middle of the cancer storm. Let's go.
Hey everyone, this is Keith Baker with the Dancing with Cancer podcast, episode 34. Is it too late for America? Now, I know this question just brings on a rush of a lot of different ideas, a lot of different concepts, and even almost need to quantify the question because there's so many different levels of what you could mean when you say, is it too late for America? So, but we do want to jump into that conversation and talk about that question from many different perspectives. I do have, or I've talked to many people recently who are, quite frankly, scared for America, for where America is heading and the direction it's going and how quickly it's getting there. and I recognize that many people would say, well, God's in control, so it doesn't matter. I totally understand that God is in control, and I individually and personally have submitted my life to Christ, and whatever that encompasses, I'm good with. I can live with. I can deal with. But it's kind of like saying it doesn't matter if I live in China or the United States. God's in control. Yeah, that's true. And again, if God told me to go to China, I'd go to China and live in China. But to pretend that there's no difference in living in China than there is in living in the United States is crazy. And the fact that we could lose the freedoms that we've come to, I think, take for granted, and become just like China pretty quickly at this point, pretty easily, I think is what the concern for most people. I know a lot of people, I think if you were to ask 100 people if they felt like America is heading towards or becoming more brighter, better, safer, and less violent, or do they feel like America is becoming darker and worse and less safe and more violence, I believe 8 out of 10 would say the latter, that they feel like America is heading in a direction that's not good, that is getting darker, that is getting more violent, that is getting less safe. And I recognize that some people would make the argument, well, it's no worse than it's ever been. It's just we have 24-hour news cycles, so we see it. It's thrown right in our faces, and we have the internet that makes a lot of information available, like right now, instantaneously, where it used to be at one point in time where something could happen in Cincinnati and you wouldn't even know about it in Florida. Or something could happen in Florida and you wouldn't even know about it in Cincinnati until, like the Pony Express came and told you or whatever. So I do believe that both of those things are factors. In other words, that the fact that we do have a 24-hour news cycle, meaning that most of our news stations, the CNNs, the MSNBCs, the Fox Newses, that they have to create 24 hours worth of news. And because of that, I think they create a lot more stories maybe than what there was a time when you had 6 o'clock news and 11 o'clock news or something of that nature. So you got an hour in the evening, and most people did one or the other. They did the hour at 6 o'clock or they did the hour at 11 o'clock, depending on their schedule. And usually then that hour was broken up to world news, you got local news, you got economic news, all that was put into that 1 hour newscast, where now it is, again, 24-hour news that they have to fill. And if we're being honest, usually bad news sells better than good news does. So I think there is a certain amount of truth to the fact that we're going to hear a lot more bad news today than we did 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But I also believe there's truth to the fact that we're, as a nation, heading in the wrong direction and that things are definitively getting worse. There was a Reuters poll recently that came out that said 4 in 5 Americans fear the country is sliding into chaos. 4 in 5, that's 80% of Americans, fear that the country is sliding into chaos. That says something. It says something about, again, what people are thinking and where they're at and where they think the country is heading. Again, I'm not in any way trying to make a political thing out of this. I just want us to talk about and think about our country and maybe even ask the question, we know in the Old Testament, nations were judged by God, not just individuals, but nations were judged by God. And so the question is, does God still judge nations, or does he just judge individuals? And oftentimes I wonder if a lot of times, at least in modern times, that the judgment of God on a nation isn't so much a judgment of God on a nation as much as it is the natural outcomes from making bad decisions. We know as individuals, right, you reap what you sow. And as individuals, that bad choices lead to bad consequences. Well, if the majority of the individuals are making bad choices, then the majority of Americans are going to be reaping the consequences of the bad decisions that they are making. And we understand that in a broken world, oftentimes your bad decision affects my life. If I was to steal something from you, I made the bad choice, but it affected your life. So a lot of times the bad choices of one person affects someone else. We also know that U.S. depression rates, the rate of the number of people who are struggling with depression has gone up dramatically. And this is especially true with young people who, on the one hand, you would say should be the most protected from depression. They live in a world where they got more stuff than probably any other generation before them, and they have access to more things. And so they should be living high and, having good times and that kind of thing. But the reality is that young people in America struggle with depression a lot. We also know that in the same time period, over the last few decades, the amount of people who engage in religious activities has dropped severely. So church attendance, for example, was around 42% 2 decades ago, and now it's down to 30%. Now, I get just going to church doesn't make you a Christian, and it's not an automatic thing, but I believe it is a very real visual indicator that can be measured. But in addition to that, if you take it one step farther, if you look at the number of people who identify, themselves as either believers or non-believers, Christian, Catholic, Jewish, versus the number of people who identify themselves consciously out loud, say, no, I'm not a believer, I'm an atheist, agnostic, or a secularist, those types of things, but they specifically do not identify with any organized religion, the numbers have shifted dramatically in that arena as well. It's similar to the church attendance numbers. And so we're seeing that the nation of America is moving away from God. I believe we were a nation specifically founded upon the belief in God, and specifically the belief of the God of the Bible. Not just a God, but specifically the God of the Bible. And I believe because of that belief system, we intentionally, as Americans, over the period of 200 years, it didn't all happen right away, but it was built into our foundations. As a few examples, we used to, every time Congress would meet, they would open with prayer. That they would literally open every session of Congress with a prayer to God, asking for wisdom and his guidance and those types of things. Our Supreme Court has the Ten Commandments engraved. And it's almost like they had the forethought to say, you know what, there's going to come a day when we will drift away from God. And so we're not just going to put a poster in the building, or we're not just going to hang a picture on the wall. No, we're going to engrave it into the building. And the Ten Commandments are engraved in the Supreme Court of the United States because they believed that the Bible was that important to law, to understanding of laws. Matter of fact, back in the 1800s, and maybe earlier, I'm not sure exactly when time period, part of taking training to become a lawyer, you had to study the Bible. And part of the reason was because they believed that American law was based on Scripture. And Charles Finney, for example, is an evangelist from the 1800s who is known for reaching just thousands upon thousands of people and traveling from town to town preaching. But he became a Christian by studying the Bible while he was going to law school. So we have in the last 50 years systematically taken God out of the public arena, and we've eliminated one thing after another after another. Now, our money says, "In God we trust." Again, it was an attempt by the leadership of America to say, hey, we stand with God, and God is important to us as a nation, as a group. God was important to us, or is important to us. Now, it still says on our money, "In God we trust," but I believe it's just a matter of time till that gets changed. I believe that there is an effort being made. We are, as a nation, not as individuals, but as a nation, we are systematically taking God out of any of the public arena. And I think we're seeing the byproduct of that. We're both in maybe God's removed his hand of blessing or his hand of protections, or maybe it's just simply that we are demoralizing as a people. You know, as we become more and more immoral and we make worse choices, then the natural outcomes from those choices is destroying this nation. But we are very much self-destructing as a nation. And it is scary. Matthew 7:13, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. Now, this passage we've all probably heard before at one time or another in church, and when I read this verse, it makes a lot of sense to me from a logical perspective. In other words, to become a believer requires choosing to live a specific lifestyle, to intentionally, or one, just being intentional about our life choices and lifestyles. And it requires discipline a lot of times. So to go through the narrow gate requires discipline and intentionality, and even recognizing that there is an option of a narrow gate and a wide gate, where I believe that human nature by default takes you through the wide gate. In other words, current is flowing that direction. And you will go with the current unless you intentionally decide not to. And then you will go against the current intentionally. And that takes a lot of extra effort and work. It can be done, and it should be done, it needs to be done, but it doesn't happen automatically, and it doesn't happen naturally. So again, we got this passage in Matthew chapter 7, verse 13. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. So when I look at our world, if I'm being honest, there's a lot more sinners than there are people of faith. And that number seems to be increasing, if anything. The number of believers versus the number of non-believers or atheists or secularists or whatever, it seems to be getting more secularists, more atheists, more unbelievers, non-believers, or just agnostic, as opposed to those who specifically believe in a God. And in my case, I'm specifically talking about believers in the Christian God or the God of the Bible. So what that verse says, I see playing out in the real world. It seems pretty straightforward to me and pretty honest. It makes a lot of sense. So just take that concept, that thought, and put it in the back of your head for a moment and just kind of put pause button there for a minute. We're going to come back to it, but just put pause button there. So if all of that is true, that wide is the gate that leads to destruction, and it looks like the large majority of people in America are choosing that, are falling into that. They're getting carried away with the current. The question becomes, has the current become so strong that it's too late to make a U-turn? That it's too late to try to redirect people towards the narrow gate instead of the wide gate? How do we convince them that the narrow gate, although it may be a harder path in the short term, is the best path? And how do we help them see that the future is not decided yet? And every one of us have a part in that. In other words, the choices that we make as individuals will impact us as a group, as a nation as well. And I think that's the part that's kind of maybe hard for us to get a handle on and understand. And so over the next 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to talk about this subject, and we're going to look at it from different angles, and we're going to answer some of those questions about if this is the case, if things are getting worse because of choices people are making, and if indeed wide is the gate that leads to destruction, and if indeed the majority of Americans are going that way, is America doomed? And if it isn't, then how do we change it? What can we do as individuals? Again, I'm one person, and I forget what the numbers are, maybe 300 million people in America, something like that. How do I make a difference? And can I make a difference? And I'm sure prayer is a part of that, but exactly what do we pray for? How do we pray? And what about our family and friends and those are people closest to us, and just a lot of questions about the future that I think we really need to deal with and come to terms with if we have any chance of turning the ship around. I don't think it'll be easy. And again, you're kind of going against the odds. I'm just being honest. But again, I believe that revivals have happened in the history of America in the past, and they did change the direction of the nation. And those revivals seem to be the most likely at the most unlikely times. In other words, when it seems like things have gotten the worst, I think it creates an environment that is ripe for revival. Because what happens is people are in a place right now where they're scared. There's a lot of people in the place where they're tired, they're hurting, they're broken, and a lot of them are frustrated, and they just want it to stop. They want it to stop. And I think deep down in their heart of hearts, they know something is wrong. They know there is a better way, but they don't know how to get there. And so that's what we're going to look at over the next few weeks. So please come back next Monday. See us again. We love you guys, and we appreciate your prayers and your concerns, and know that we are praying for you as well. Again, hit the like, the subscribe, and the bell, and we will see you next week.